There's a small, easy-to-miss detail in one of the most famous name changes in the Bible. When God tells Abram his name is changing to Abraham, the new name isn't a different word entirely. It's the old name with one extra letter inserted into the middle of it. A single Hebrew letter, pronounced He, added into a name that already existed, changing its sound and its meaning at once. And that same letter, inserted the same way, shows up again a few verses later when Sarai becomes Sarah. It's not a coincidence, and it's not decorative. That letter is one of the building blocks of God's own name in Hebrew. When God renames someone in the Bible, the pattern that repeats case after case isn't simply give them a different label. It's closer to something more specific and stranger. God's own name, or a fragment of it, gets physically inserted into the person's existing name, so that the new identity carries a piece of the divine name inside its own spelling from that point forward. This happens at least 5 separate times across Scripture to 5 different people in 5 different circumstances. A childless old man, his equally childless wife, a man who spends a night wrestling a stranger by a riverbank, a warrior sent to scout a hostile land, a fisherman standing in front of a rabbi for the first time, and it happens once more in reverse when a foreign empire renames 4 Hebrew teenagers specifically to strip the same divine fragment back out of their names and replace it with the name of a different god entirely. Laid out together, in order, the pattern says something neither instance says on its own. Most readers encounter these name changes individually, scattered across years of separate Bible reading, and treat each one as a private, self-contained episode in that particular person's story. Abram becomes Abraham somewhere in Genesis. Jacob becomes Israel somewhere later. Simon becomes Peter somewhere in the Gospels. 3 unrelated plot points that happen to involve a name swap. That reading isn't wrong, but it misses something the original language preserves and most English translations quietly smooth over. In several of these cases, the new name isn't actually a new word. It's the same name the person already had, with a small, specific, meaningful piece of Hebrew inserted into it, usually a fragment connected to God's own name. English translation can preserve the new spelling. Abram becomes Abraham on the page, but it can't easily show a reader that the difference between the 2 spellings is exactly the letter you'd expect if someone had reached into the name and physically written part of God's own identity into it. This matters because it changes what renaming is actually doing in these stories. If each case were simply God gives someone a nicer sounding name, the pattern wouldn't carry much theological weight. Plenty of ancient Near Eastern cultures renamed people for all sorts of reasons: prestige, conquest, adoption into a new household. What makes the biblical pattern distinct is the specific, repeated mechanism, not a new word substituted for an old one, but an existing name altered by the insertion of a fragment of the divine name itself, so that the bearer now carries, spelled directly into their own identity, a small piece of who renamed them. And once you see that mechanism clearly, the one case where it runs in reverse, where a foreign power performs the identical operation but to remove God's name from a person's identity rather than insert it, stops looking like an unrelated footnote and starts looking like the same story told from the other direction.
Here's the 2-part key the text actually hands you once you trace what's physically happening inside each name, rather than treating the change as simply cosmetic. The first part is the mechanism itself. Genesis 17:5 has God saying to Abram, "Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made thee." In Hebrew, Abram is pronounced Avram. Abraham is pronounced Avraham. the same 3 consonants of the original name with a hey inserted before the final consonant. That letter, hey, is one of the 4 letters making up the Tetragrammaton, God's own personal name. 10 verses later, the same operation happens to his wife. Thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarai shall her name be. Sarai, pronounced Sarai, becomes Sarah, pronounced Sarah, the same insertion, the same letter, the same source.
The second part is that this isn't an isolated technique used only once. It recurs with different specific letters and different specific meanings across several of the other name changes this video is about to walk through. Hoshea becoming Joshua by having the divine name prefixed onto the front of his existing name rather than inserted into its middle. Jacob becoming Israel by having his name reconstructed around a verb describing a struggle with God himself. The mechanism varies in its specific mechanics from case to case, but the underlying move stays consistent. The new name is never a stranger's name handed to a stranger. It's the old name deliberately altered by the insertion of something connected to God, so the change itself becomes a small, permanent, spelled-out record of the encounter that caused it. If the fact that Abraham is just Abram with a piece of God's own name physically inserted into it is new to you, that's exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to dig up. A like helps more people find it. Here's the full set. Genesis 32:24-28 records the strangest of the 5. Jacob, alone at night by the river Jabbok, wrestles with a mysterious figure until daybreak, refusing to let go until he receives a blessing. The figure asks his name and then delivers the change. Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. Jacob, pronounced Yaakov, is built from a root meaning heel, tied earlier in Genesis to the story of him grasping his twin brother's heel at birth, and by extension, supplanter, one who trips up or displaces another. Israel, pronounced Yisrael, is built from a different root, pronounced Sarah, to strive, to contend, combined with El, one of the Bible's names for God. The new name doesn't erase the old story, it reframes it, from a man who displaces his brother by grasping at heels to a man who has now wrestled with God directly and survived it. Numbers 13:16 records a quieter, easy-to-miss instance. As Moses sends 12 men to scout the land of Canaan, the text notes, almost in passing, and Moses called Hoshea the son of Nun, Yehoshua. Hoshea, pronounced Hoshea, simply means salvation or he saves. Moses prefixes the divine name onto the front of it, producing Yehoshua, pronounced Yehoshua, the Lord is salvation, or more literally, Yahweh saves. The change takes a name that names an abstract quality and turns it into a name that names who is actually doing the saving. And this exact name, Yehoshua, is the same Hebrew name that centuries later, filtered through Greek, becomes Jesus, pronounced Jesus, Jesus.
The pattern continues directly into the Gospels, in a scene most readers remember for its content without necessarily connecting it to the same mechanism running through Genesis and Numbers. John 1:22 describes the very first meeting between Jesus and a fisherman named Simon. And when Jesus beheld him, he said, Thou art Simon the son of Jonah. Thou shalt be called Cephas, which is by interpretation a stone. Cephas is Aramaic, pronounced Kepha, meaning rock or stone. Peter, the name that sticks in most English Bibles, is simply the Greek translation of the same word, pronounced Petros. Matthew 16:18 records Jesus expanding on the naming later, in a scene where the wordplay is explicit in the Greek. Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Petros and Petra, rock, deliberately chosen to echo each other. Unlike Abraham, Sarah, Israel, and Joshua, Peter's new name doesn't insert a fragment of the divine name directly into his old one, but the pattern holds in a different way. The new name is assigned by the one doing the renaming as a direct statement about the role that person is being given, spoken at the very moment the relationship begins, rather than after years of proven character.
5 renamings, 5 different mechanisms, one shared logic. The new name isn't a replacement identity handed to a stranger. It's the old name, or the old person, deliberately reworked by the one doing the renaming, so that the change itself becomes a permanent, spoken record of an encounter, a promise, a struggle, a mission, a role, carried forward in the sound of the name from that point on. It's worth clearing up a common addition to this list before moving on, because it's the one most people assume belongs here and doesn't, at least not in the same sense. Saul becoming Paul is often taught as a 6th divine renaming, parallel to Abram becoming Abraham, dramatic conversion, dramatic new name. But Acts 13:9 introduces the shift with different language than any of the 5 cases above.
Then Saul, who also is called Paul, not God renamed him, not his name shall no more be called, simply a narrative note that he went by both names, Saul being his Hebrew name, and Paulus, a Roman family name he likely carried from birth as a Roman citizen, the kind of dual naming common among Jews of the diaspora living under Roman law. The text shifts to using Paul consistently from that point in Acts onward, but never frames the shift as a renaming event the way it explicitly does for Abram, Sarai, Jacob, and Hoshea. Worth knowing, precisely because it's such a natural guess, and precisely because the actual 5 cases are stranger and more deliberate than a simple dual name convention. One case runs the entire pattern in reverse, and reading it directly against the 5 above sharpens what was happening in all of them.
Daniel 1:6-7 introduces 4 young men taken captive to Babylon after Jerusalem's fall. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. Look closely at what's being removed. Daniel, pronounced Daniel, means God is my judge. The El, God, sitting directly inside the name, the same way it sits inside Israel. Hananiah, pronounced Hananiah, means the Lord has been gracious, carrying the divine name Yah directly inside it. Mishael, pronounced Mishael, means who is what God is. Azariah, pronounced Azariel, means the Lord has helped. All 4 names carry a fragment of the God of Israel's name built directly into their structure, the identical mechanism running through Abraham, Sarah, Israel, and Joshua, just already present at birth rather than added later. And their new Babylonian names systematically strip that fragment out and replace it with something else entirely. Belteshazzar, pronounced Belteshazzar, likely invokes Bel, pronounced Bel, the Babylonian god also known as Marduk, pronounced Marduk. Abednego, pronounced Abednego, almost certainly means servant of Nego, referring to Nebo, pronounced Nebo, another Babylonian deity. The empire doing the renaming understood exactly what it was doing, not simply assigning convenient local names to foreign captives, but performing the identical operation God performs in Genesis and Numbers, aimed in the opposite direction, removing the divine fragment from an identity rather than inserting it, replacing the God of a conquered people with the gods of the conquering one, spelled directly into the only thing a captive typically got to keep, his own name. Read side by side, the 6 cases stop being 6 unrelated anecdotes and become one consistent argument about what a name change in Scripture is actually claiming to do. Not cosmetic relabeling in either direction, but a genuine spoken claim about which God a person now belongs to, made durable by writing that claim directly into the sound of their name. Here's what this means for anyone who has only ever registered these stories as separate trivia. Abram became Abraham. Jacob became Israel, without noticing the mechanism repeating underneath all of them.
It reframes what these renamings were actually claiming. In every case where God does the renaming, the point was never merely rhetorical flourish or narrative color. A fragment of God's own identity became permanently, audibly, part of how that person would be addressed for the rest of their life, and in most cases, for the rest of biblical history. Every time anyone said Abraham afterward, they were, whether they thought about it or not, saying part of God's name out loud. The reverse case in Daniel makes the stakes of that mechanism unmistakable. An empire that wanted to erase a captive people's God from their daily lives understood that starting with the name was not a small or symbolic move.
If there's someone in your life who's ever wondered whether their own name or a name they've given someone else carries any weight beyond simple identification, this pattern is worth sharing with them. Not as a rule that everyone's name must mean something profound, but as evidence that in Scripture's own logic, names were never treated as arbitrary labels, and the specific, repeated technique of inserting a divine fragment into an existing name is one of the clearest places that logic shows its actual mechanics. There's a second, quieter application worth sitting with too. In every case where God does the renaming, the old name never fully disappears from the story. Genesis keeps using Jacob alongside Israel for the rest of the book, sometimes in the very same paragraph, and the text never seems bothered by the overlap. The new name doesn't erase the old story of heel grasping and displacement. It stands next to it, a second, truer thing now also true about the same person. That's a gentler way to hold your own history than either denying it or being befined only by it. The record of who you were doesn't have to vanish for the record of who you've become to be just as real.
Step back and look at the whole shape of it. One repeated mechanism, appearing across 5 separate renamings by God. A fragment of the divine name physically inserted into a name the person already had. Abram gaining a letter to become Abraham. Sarai gaining the same letter to become Sarah. Jacob's name rebuilt around a verb for striving with God to become Israel. Hoshea gaining the divine name as a prefix to become Joshua, the same name that centuries later becomes Jesus. One case, Simon becoming Peter, where the mechanism shifts from inserting God's name to assigning a role directly at the very first meeting in a Greek wordplay preserved deliberately by the gospel writer. One case running entirely in reverse, an empire stripping the divine fragment out of 4 names: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, each one carrying God or the Lord built directly into its structure, and replacing it with the names of Babylon's own gods, understanding correctly that a captive people's identity could be reshaped, starting with the sound of their own names.
Picture a stonemason chiseling a single new letter into a name already carved above a doorway, not tearing down the doorway, not carving an entirely new name, just one letter added or removed, changing forever how the name sounds when it's spoken aloud by everyone who passes underneath it. That's the picture underneath every renaming in this list in both directions. Not a new identity, the old one permanently marked by whoever it now belongs to. If you've read these 6 stories scattered across years of Bible reading without ever laying them side by side, the pattern is worth returning to on purpose. 5 times, God takes a name that already exists and writes a fragment of his own identity into it, permanently, audibly, every time it's spoken afterward. Once, an empire does the same operation in reverse, understanding exactly what was at stake in doing so.
It's worth asking, gently, whether there's a name in your own life, your own or someone else's, currently carrying more weight than you'd normally notice, the way Abraham carried a letter of God's name every time anyone addressed him for the rest of his life. If this changed how you read any of these 6 stories, tell us in the comments which renaming struck you most. That's worth talking through together rather than keeping to yourself. And if this is the kind of pattern you'd never noticed strung together before, a like helps more people run into it the way you just did. Subscribe. This channel exists for exactly this kind of thing. 6 stories everyone already knows individually,
waiting for someone to lay them next to each other.